So we're going to talk about your new book. Before that, let's just spend a minute or two on India, because we talked about it before. You were one of the first ones that I saw who suggested maybe it wouldn't be a landslide for Modi. What are the possible consequences, do you think, for economic policy of what we've seen?
Well, I think that the way the election result has been interpreted is that in some ways it's seen as if this is a two-speed economy going on in India, that the urban consumer is in good health and almost booming, but the rural economy in India, in many parts at least, is in some sort of distress. So I suspect that there'll be some shift in terms of the spending priorities of the government in favor more of the rural economy and trying to do something a bit more about that. But I'd say the big takeaway of this election, and I think that this is something which I think has been really underappreciated, that if you look at elections around the world, and particularly if you look at even India's electoral history, after an election, it is usually viewed as a mandate for something. And at the same time, the opposition, at least for a while, goes into retreat. Because they've just lost an election, they go into retreat and try and regroup. What's very unique about this Indian election is that even though Modi won, it is seen by many people as some sort of a moral defeat, just because the benchmark was so high and he's ended up with seats which are well short of the majority mark just for his own party. On the other hand, the opposition is already behaving as if it won. It's been emboldened, it's out there, much more aggressive, and a lot of the post-poll analysis is, why did the opposition do so well? So this is a very strange election that way, that it's not been a cleansing or a catharsis in some way. It's been like, in terms of the consequences are going to be that the opposition from day one is going to be emboldened, and I dare say almost disruptive. So I don't see that much policy action take place in India, given this verdict.
You mentioned urban versus rural. What about socioeconomic distinctions? Because there have been some reports I've seen that, in fact, one of the things that turned on Prime Minister Modi was the fact that the lower income people felt that they'd been left behind.
Yeah, but I think there are many stories in India, because what is true in one state is not true in another state. And I think that's the part about India which we have spoken about, and something which I think is not fully understood by many people, that what happened in this election also is that there was no wave. There was no wave for Modi. Instead, we ended up in the traditional India, where every state had its own contest in many ways. And so therefore, you got an outcome which was an aggregation of what the various states were doing. And you're right, there was some feeling in some states, which even I traveled to, such as Maharashtra, where a lot of people felt that they were not getting the benefits of what was being promised, and they were facing some sort of local issues. So that's true in terms of socioeconomic divide. And yes, more of the poor, it seems, did vote, and more of the so-called, what they call in India, the backward caste, they voted for the opposition parties rather than Modi. So that's true. But it's a much more nuanced story. But the broad takeaway, as I said, is that I expect very little to get done in terms of new policies over the next year from an economic perspective.
One of the things we talked about in the past was the growth policies of Prime Minister Modi, combined with relative restraint on inflation, being able to really contain that. Is it likely that in order to reach out to some of the people that he did not bring along with him, Prime Minister Modi will be driven to drive higher inflation through more stimulus?
I hope not, because I feel that if there's one relative success story that the government had over the last 5 to 10 years, it was on keeping inflation relatively low. Now, of course, in India's case, whenever you go out and talk to people, they will always tell you that rising prices is an issue, because in India's case, so many people are living at the margin, they can't afford any increase in prices. But generally, in India's case, the inflation performance was much better. In fact, the big problem with the previous government was that they let inflation get out of control. So I think if he has any sort of, sensitivity to what people want, and I think this is true everywhere. We're seeing it in the US as well, that we don't know whether good economic growth gets you re-elected, but we do know for sure that if you end up with high inflation, that gets you into big trouble. And even the US, which we'll speak about, the high inflation rates of the last 3 to 4 years are a real problem for the Biden administration.